It was the dead of night when it first happened. I remember it clearly because the clock by my bed blinked 3:13 a.m. as if it were mocking me. The room was covered in darkness, the only light being the faint glow from the street lamp outside, filtering through the curtain. I had been struggling with insomnia for weeks, and that night, I was finally drifting off into a restless sleep when I felt it. Something off, something wrong. A heavy weight pressed down on my chest, pinning me to the bed. My eyes shot open, but my body refused to move. I was frozen, paralyzed, completely aware yet utterly powerless. Panic surged through me as I tried to scream, but my throat betrayed me. Not even a whisper escaped my lips. Then I noticed it, movement in the corner of the room. My heart pounded furiously in my chest as I strained my eyes, trying to focus. The shadows seemed to deepen, coalescing into a shape, a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and gaunt, blending with the darkness. But it was the eyes that terrified me the most, two pinpricks of light, glinting like cold steel, staring directly at me. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the light, just my sleep-deprived brain playing games, but the fear gnawing at my gut told me otherwise. This was real. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, it simply watched. Its presence was suffocating, an oppressive force that made the air thick and heavy. My lungs burned as I struggled to draw breath, the pressure on my chest increasing with every passing second. In that moment, I was certain I was going to die. My vision began to blur, and black spots danced in front of my eyes. Just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the weight lifted. I gasped for air, my body trembling as I regained control. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there, leaving me alone in the darkness. My room was silent, save for the frantic beating of my heart. The next morning, I dismissed it as a nightmare, albeit a disturbingly vivid one. I tried to forget, to move on, but the memory of those cold, unblinking eyes haunted me. I convinced myself it was just stress, that the sleep paralysis was a one-time thing. But deep down, I knew better. The episodes started happening more frequently, always around the same time, 3:13 a.m. Each time, I would be trapped in my bed, paralyzed, with that same figure standing in the corner, watching, waiting. The fear grew, feeding on itself, until I dreaded going to sleep. I tried everything, sleep aids, meditation, even therapy, but nothing worked. The figure was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness. One night, I decided to film myself while I slept, hoping to catch some evidence, anything that would explain what was happening to me. I set up my phone on a tripod, aimed it at my bed, and let it record. The next morning, I woke up drenched in sweat, the memory of those piercing eyes still fresh in my mind. My phone was still recording, battery nearly dead. With trembling hands, I stopped the video and played it back. At first, there was nothing, just me, tossing and turning in my sleep. But then, at exactly 3:13 a.m., I saw it. My body went still, and the shadow appeared in the corner, just as I had seen it so many times before. But this time, it didn't stay in the corner. It moved. The figure stepped closer to the bed, its movements slow and deliberate, until it was standing right beside me. I watched in horror as it leaned down, its face hovering inches above mine. And then, in a moment that made my blood run cold, it looked directly at the camera. The video ended abruptly, the screen going black. I haven't slept since. That was 3 days ago. I've tried showing the video to others, but no one else can see the figure. It's just static, a corrupted file, they say. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it is, it's coming for me. Tonight, I've decided to stay awake. I've surrounded myself with lights, the brightest I could find, hoping that they'll keep it at bay. But as the clock ticks closer to 3:13 a.m., I can feel the pressure in the room building, the air growing thicker, heavier. And I know it's only a matter of time before it comes again. I never believed in the supernatural, not really. Sure, I'd heard stories, seen the movies, but I always dismissed them as exaggerations or tricks of the mind. I was a rational person, grounded in reality. But there's a moment in life when your sense of reality shatters, and what you once thought impossible becomes undeniable. For me, that moment came in the most ordinary of settings, my own bedroom. It was an unusually quiet night. The kind where the silence feels heavy, pressing in from all sides. I had just returned from a long day at work and was looking forward to a peaceful night of sleep. As I lay in bed, I noticed a strange stillness in the air, as if the entire world had paused. The clock on my nightstand read 2:59 a.m. I must have dozed off for a moment, but when I opened my eyes again, something felt different. I couldn't move. My body was pinned to the mattress, completely paralyzed. Panic surged through me, but I tried to stay calm, rationalize what was happening. Sleep paralysis, I thought. I had read about it before, but I'd never experienced it myself. I focused on my breathing, trying to will my limbs to move. That's when I heard it, a soft creak, like the sound of someone slowly stepping on a wooden floorboard. The noise came from the hallway outside my bedroom, faint but unmistakable. My heart began to race, the sound growing louder with each passing second, until it was just outside my door. I wanted to turn my head to see who or what was there, but my body refused to obey. The door was slightly ajar, and through the small gap, I saw something move. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room, slipping into the space between the door and the frame. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it an intruder? Someone who had broken in while I slept? But there was no sound of forced entry, no shattered glass or broken locks. Just that creaking, those deliberate, measured steps. The shadow moved again, and this time, it slipped into the room. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it drift silently across the floor. It wasn't a person, at least not in any normal sense. There were no discernible features, just a void, an absence of light in the shape of a man. The figure approached the side of my bed, and I could feel its presence like a cold draft against my skin. My eyes strained in the darkness, trying to make out any detail, but it was as if my vision was failing me, refusing to fully comprehend what I was seeing. It stopped beside me, and for a moment, everything was still. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural tension. Then, I felt it, a sensation like cold fingers brushing against my forehead. The touch was light, almost tender, but it sent a wave of terror through me. It wasn't the touch of something living. It was cold, devoid of warmth, like the chill of death. The pressure on my chest intensified, making it harder to breathe. My vision blurred, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. But the figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, as if observing me, waiting for something. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breaths. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to fade. The darkness around it seemed to dissipate, and the room slowly returned to normal. My body jerked as if released from invisible bonds, and I gasped, drawing in a deep breath as I finally regained control. I lay there, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. The clock now read 3:17 a.m. It had felt like an eternity, but only a few minutes had passed. I bolted upright, scanning the room, but there was no trace of the shadow. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the overwhelming sense of dread that lingered in the air. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it had just been a vivid dream or a hallucination brought on by sleep paralysis. But as the days went by, the memory of that night continued to haunt me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that cold touch, that silent, watchful presence. I stopped sleeping with the door ajar after that. I even installed extra locks in the security system, but none of it helped. Because deep down, I knew that whatever it was, it didn't need doors or windows to get in. And now, every night, As the clock approaches 3 a.m., I lie awake, waiting, listening for the creak of floorboards, the soft brush of cold fingers against my skin. Because I know, sooner or later, it will come back. And next time, I might not wake up at all. I always thought sleep paralysis was just a creepy story people told to scare each other, a weird glitch in the brain that wasn't really dangerous. That was until it happened to me, and now, I wish I could go back to being blissfully ignorant. It started on an ordinary night, one of those nights when you're so tired that your head hits the pillow and you're out within seconds. I'd been working late, exhausted from a deadline that had drained me over the past week. I fell asleep almost instantly, but the peace didn't last long. Suddenly, I was awake, fully awake. But something was wrong. My eyes were open, and I could see my room, dimly lit by the street lamp outside, casting soft shadows on the walls. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. I couldn't move. My arms, legs, even my fingers were locked in place. Panic set in almost immediately, but I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even scream. At first, I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that I was just dreaming. I'd read about sleep paralysis before, how your mind wakes up before your body, leaving you trapped for a few terrifying moments. It was supposed to be harmless. But what happened next made me realize this was something far worse than any article could prepare me for. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. But then, I noticed a shadow. Not a fleeting one, not a trick of the light. This was something real, something I could feel in my gut. The shadow was perfectly still, like a person standing just out of view, waiting. My pulse quickened, the sound of my heart beating loud in my ears. I tried with all my might to turn my head, to look directly at the door, but my body refused to cooperate. My eyes were fixed on that shadow, which seemed to grow darker, more solid, as if whatever was casting it was coming closer. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible creak, the kind you only notice in the dead of night when everything else is silent. The door was moving. Slowly, so slowly, it began to open wider. My breath hitched, my chest tight with terror, as I desperately tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't just sleep paralysis. Someone was in my house. The door swung open fully now, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the frame. My mind raced, every rational thought colliding with raw fear. I kept telling myself it was a dream, but it felt too real. The chill in the air, the weight on my chest, the creeping dread that something was terribly wrong. Then I saw it. From the corner of my eye, a figure stepped into the room. It was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but there was no mistaking it. This was a person, standing in my bedroom, just a few feet away from me. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might explode, but I couldn't do anything. I was completely helpless, a prisoner in my own body, as this intruder slowly approached the side of my bed. The figure stopped, standing so close I could feel the cold radiating from it. It leaned in, and though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was looking directly at me, studying me. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the very air around me was thick with malevolence. Suddenly, it bent down, bringing its face inches from mine. My breath caught in my throat as I saw, in the dim light, a pair of eyes, cold, emotionless eyes, staring straight into mine. The figure whispered something, a string of words too soft for me to understand, but the sound sent a wave of nausea through me. It was like hearing your worst nightmare spoken in a language you could almost understand, but not quite. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stood up and walked out of the room, disappearing into the hallway. The door slowly closed behind it, the click of the latch echoing in the silence. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. After what felt like an eternity, the weight on my chest lifted, and I could move again. I bolted upright, gasping for air, and scrambled to turn on the light. My room was empty. The door was shut, just as I'd left it before going to bed. But the memory of those eyes, that whisper, was burned into my mind. I spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed, every light in the house on, clutching my phone, too terrified to call anyone because I didn't even know what to say. What had I just experienced? Was it real, or was it all in my head? The lines between reality and nightmare had blurred, leaving me questioning everything. The next day, I checked every lock, every window, but there was no sign of forced entry, no sign that anyone had been in the house but me. But that doesn't change what I saw, what I felt. It doesn't change the fact that, sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, terrified that the door will creak open again and that figure will be there, watching me, waiting for something I can't comprehend. And now, I can't help but wonder, what if it wasn't just sleep paralysis? What if it was something more? Something that's still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of sleep, waiting for the next time I can't move, can't scream, can't escape. I used to think I was safe in my own home, especially in my bedroom, where the outside world couldn't reach me. But that belief was shattered in a single, horrifying morning that I still can't fully explain. It was around 5 a.m. when I woke up, and I remember it vividly because it was one of those mornings where everything feels wrong, but you can't quite place why. I had been sleeping on my back, something I never do, and as I opened my eyes, I immediately knew something was off. The room was bathed in that eerie pre-dawn light where everything is cast in shades of gray, and I could hear the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the only sound breaking the silence. But I couldn't move. My arms, my legs, even my fingers, they were all pinned down as if by an invisible force. Panic surged through me as I struggled to understand what was happening. I tried to scream, to shout for help, but my voice was gone, trapped somewhere deep in my throat. All I could do was stare at the ceiling, my mind racing. That's when I heard it, the soft shuffle of feet on the carpet, coming from just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythm echoing in my ears as I strained to listen. Someone was in my apartment. Someone who shouldn't be there. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if whoever was there knew I was awake, knew I was listening. They moved closer, inching towards the door, and then they stopped. I could see the door from the corner of my eye, slightly ajar, just enough to let in a sliver of the hallway light. The shadow of feet appeared in that gap, motionless, as if whoever was there was waiting, watching. I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the sound was too clear, too real. I knew every creak of this place, and I could tell the difference between a dream and reality. This was real. I was awake, and there was someone standing outside my bedroom. I focused all my energy on trying to move, to break free from whatever was holding me down. But my body refused to obey, no matter how much I struggled. The panic was suffocating, every second stretching into an eternity as I lay there, helpless, praying that it would end. The door creaked, slowly, inching open as the shadow moved into the room. My vision was limited, but I could see enough, the dark outline of a figure stepping quietly inside, careful not to make too much noise. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest as the figure moved closer to the bed. It was tall, its movements unnervingly calm, as if it had all the time in the world. It stopped at the foot of the bed, just out of my line of sight. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, a cold, invasive force that made my skin crawl. I kept trying to move, to scream, to do anything, but I was still locked in place, trapped in my own body. Then, I felt the bed dip, just slightly, as if someone had placed a hand on the mattress. My eyes darted frantically, but I couldn't see what it was doing. I could only hear the steady breathing, close, too close, as it leaned over me. Suddenly, I felt a pressure on my chest, light at first, then growing heavier. It was like someone was pressing down on me with both hands, slowly crushing the air out of my lungs. I gasped for breath, my vision blurring as the weight became unbearable. My mind was screaming, but no sound came out. The figure didn't say anything, didn't make any sound, but its intentions were clear. It was trying to suffocate me. Just when I thought I was going to pass out, everything stopped. The pressure lifted, the figure stepped back, and for a moment, I could breathe again. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might stop. But before I could make sense of what was happening, the figure turned and walked out of the room, the door closing softly behind it. I lay there, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. Slowly, painfully, I regained control over my limbs. I sat up, shaking, drenched in sweat, and stared at the door. It was shut, as if nothing had happened. The apartment was silent, no sign of anyone else there. I didn't sleep for the rest of the morning. I didn't even leave the bed until the sun was fully up and I could convince myself that it was safe to move. When I finally did get up, I checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. But there was nothing, no sign of an intruder, no indication that anyone had been there but me. But I know what I experienced. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't my imagination. I've lived in this apartment for years, and I've never felt unsafe until that morning. Now, every time I go to bed, I double-check the locks, make sure the door is tightly closed, and sleep with a heavy object by my side, just in case. But deep down, I know that no lock, no weapon can protect me from what happened. Because whatever it was, it didn't need to break in. It was already there, waiting for the moment when I was at my most vulnerable. And I can't shake the feeling that one day it will come back. I always thought I had control over my own mind. It's a comforting belief, isn't it? That whatever happens, at least you can trust your own thoughts, your own senses. But one night changed everything, and now I'm not so sure of anything anymore. It was an ordinary evening. I had just finished a long day at work, nothing special, just the usual grind. I remember feeling more exhausted than usual, though. The kind of exhaustion that sinks deep into your bones, making every movement feel like a chore. I barely managed to get through dinner before collapsing into bed, looking forward to a long, deep sleep. But that night, sleep didn't bring me any peace. It brought something else entirely. I woke up suddenly with a jolt, like someone had splashed cold water on my face. The first thing I noticed was the time, 2:37 a.m. My bedroom was dimly lit by the street lamp outside, its faint glow seeping through the thin curtains. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I tried to turn over, to get more comfortable, but I couldn't move. My body felt like it was glued to the bed, heavy and unresponsive. I couldn't even lift a finger. Panic surged through me as I realized what was happening. I'd heard of sleep paralysis before. Friends had mentioned it, describing the terrifying feeling of being awake but trapped inside your own body. But hearing about it and experiencing it are two very different things. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself it would pass in a few moments. That's what everyone said, right? It's just your brain waking up before your body. It's harmless. But the longer I lay there, the more I realized something was wrong, very wrong. There was a presence in the room. I could feel it, a cold, heavy weight pressing down on the air, making it hard to breathe. My eyes were locked on the ceiling, but I could sense something in the corner of the room, just out of my line of sight. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, almost suffocating. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, just on the edge of my vision, a figure. A man, standing in the corner of my bedroom, half hidden by shadows. My heart stopped, every muscle in my body straining against the paralysis, desperate to move, to turn my head and get a better look. But I couldn't. I was trapped, forced to stare at the ceiling while this figure loomed silently in the corner. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching me. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking. The longer I stared at the ceiling, the more I became aware of him, every detail searing itself into my mind. The outline of his body was sharp, too sharp for a shadow, too defined to be a trick of the light. And then, he did something I'll never forget. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, just one step, but it was enough. The floor creaked under his weight, the sound low and menacing in the stillness of the room. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that drowned out everything else. He took another step, moving closer to the bed. I could see him more clearly now, tall, with broad shoulders, his face still obscured by darkness. But his eyes. I could see his eyes. They were bright, almost glowing, and they were locked onto mine, piercing through the shadows with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but my throat was locked tight. Not even a whisper could escape. All I could do was watch as he moved closer, inch by inch, until he was standing right next to the bed, towering over me. He leaned down, his face coming into view, and I saw him clearly for the first time. His features were sharp, unnatural, like they had been carved from stone. But it was his expression that terrified me the most. There was no anger, no malice, just a cold, detached curiosity, like he was studying me, trying to understand something. And then, without warning, he reached out. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, hovering just above my chest. I could feel the cold radiating from his fingers, a bone-deep chill that spread through my entire body. He didn't touch me, but the air around him seemed to ripple with an unseen force, pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I was sure my heart would stop from the fear, he straightened up and stepped back. He moved so fluidly, so effortlessly, as if he wasn't constrained by the physical world at all. And then, just as quietly as he had appeared, he turned and walked back to the corner, fading into the shadows. The moment he was gone, the paralysis lifted. My body jerked as if released from invisible chains, and I gasped for air, my lungs burning as I finally took in a deep breath. I sat up, my heart racing, and stared at the corner where the man had been. The room was empty, just as it had been before, but the memory of his presence lingered in the air, a cold, unsettling feeling that I couldn't shake. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing there, watching me with those cold, curious eyes. When morning finally came, I checked the room, hoping to find some sign that it had all been a nightmare, but there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed furniture, nothing to prove that anyone had been there. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And now, every night, I dread falling asleep, terrified that he'll come back. Because if he does, I don't know if I'll be able to wake up again. You never expect your own bedroom to become the scene of your worst nightmare. But that's exactly what happened to me. What I'm about to share isn't something I've ever told anyone before, because even now, months later, I can hardly believe it myself. It started like any other night. I had just finished watching a movie in the living room and dragged myself to bed, exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that makes you fall asleep the moment your head hits the pillow. I remember checking my phone one last time. It was 2:48 a.m., and then rolling over to face the window. I've always liked sleeping with the blinds slightly open, letting in just a sliver of moonlight. That was a mistake. I must have drifted off for a few minutes when I suddenly woke up, wide-eyed, completely alert. My heart was already racing, and I couldn't understand why. The room was quiet, too quiet, like the air had been sucked out, leaving only a thick, oppressive silence. I tried to roll over, to shake off the weird feeling, but that's when I realized I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. My body felt like it was being held down by an invisible force, every muscle locked in place. I tried to scream, but my throat wouldn't cooperate. All I could do was lie there, eyes wide open, staring at the window, where the thin curtains fluttered slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. And then I saw him. There was a man standing just outside my window, his face pressed against the glass. My heart nearly stopped. He was tall, his features partially obscured by the darkness, but I could see enough. His eyes, those eyes, were staring directly at me, unblinking, filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. At first, I tried to tell myself it was a dream, some kind of vivid hallucination brought on by the sleep paralysis. But I could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside, the distant hum of traffic, all too real, too tangible. This wasn't a dream. He was there, watching me, with a gaze so cold it felt like he was trying to reach into my soul. My mind raced. How did he get there? I lived on the second floor of an apartment building. No fire escape outside that window, no ledge he could have climbed. It didn't make any sense. But logic didn't matter in that moment. All that mattered was that he was there, and I was utterly helpless. I tried to move, to break free from whatever was holding me down, but my body refused to obey. The man's hand moved then, slowly, almost casually, as he began tapping on the glass with one finger, a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed in the silence of the room. Tap, tap, tap. Each tap sent a jolt of fear through me, a reminder that I was trapped, at the mercy of this stranger who shouldn't have been able to reach my window. Then, with an unsettling calm, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, not even close. It was a smile that spoke of control, of knowing he had me exactly where he wanted me. He leaned closer, his breath fogging up the glass, and mouthed something I couldn't quite make out. But I knew it wasn't good. My blood ran cold as I realized he was saying it over and over again, like a chant, his eyes never leaving mine. Just when I thought my heart couldn't take it anymore, I blinked. It was the smallest movement, a flicker of my eyelids, but it was enough. Suddenly, the pressure on my chest lifted, and I could move again. I gasped, sucking in air like I'd been drowning, my body jerking upright as I frantically looked around. The man was gone. The window was closed, the curtains still gently swaying. There was no sign that anyone had been there. But the fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach that wouldn't go away. I jumped out of bed, ran to the window, and yanked it open, leaning out to look down. Nothing. No ladder, no evidence that anyone could have climbed up. The ground below was empty, undisturbed. But I knew what I had seen. I knew that man had been there, watching me, smiling like he knew something I didn't. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I couldn't. I sat in the corner of the room, lights on, phone in hand, staring at the window, half expecting him to reappear. But he never did. Morning came, and with it, the usual noises of the city waking up. But I was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had been broken inside me. It's been months now, and I still can't bring myself to sleep with the blinds open. I keep them shut tight, locked down, like that will somehow keep the terror out. But every now and then, when I'm lying in bed, I think I hear it, the faint tapping on the glass, slow and deliberate, like he's just waiting for me to let my guard down. And that smile, it haunts my dreams whenever I sleep. You know that feeling when you wake up suddenly, in the middle of the night, and everything feels wrong? That was me, just a few nights ago. I was yanked from sleep by a sensation I couldn't place, like my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to figure out what had startled me awake. But as I opened my eyes, I immediately realized something was terribly wrong. I couldn't move. It wasn't like the grogginess you feel when you're half asleep and too tired to roll over. No, this was different. It was like my entire body was frozen, pinned to the bed by an unseen force. My eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling, but no matter how much I tried to move, no matter how much I screamed inside my head, nothing happened. Panic set in almost immediately. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just sleep paralysis, something I'd read about but never experienced. I had heard stories, sure, people waking up unable to move, feeling like there was something in the room with them. It was all supposed to be harmless, just a quirk of the brain. But as I lay there, completely paralyzed, I knew this was anything but harmless. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart hammered in my chest, the sound of those footsteps slicing through the silence of the night. They were getting closer, each step sending a jolt of terror through me. I tried to tell myself it was just the old pipes in the building, that I was imagining things, but the sound was too real, too distinct. Someone was in my house. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint light from the hallway spilling in through the gap. I strained my eyes, desperately trying to see who, or what, was out there, but the angle was wrong. All I could do was listen as the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my door. For a moment, everything was silent. The only sound was my ragged breathing, my pulse thundering in my ears. I prayed it would stop, that whoever was out there would turn around and leave. But then the door began to creak open, inch by inch, until it was fully ajar. The hallway light cast a long shadow across the floor, but I couldn't see who was standing there. My body was screaming at me to move, to get up, to do anything, but I was trapped, helpless. Then the figure stepped inside. It wasn't a shadow or a blur. It was a man, tall, his face obscured by the darkness. He stood there, just inside the doorway, and I could feel his eyes on me, feel the weight of his gaze even though I couldn't see his face. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Was this a home invasion? Was I dreaming? But it felt too real, every detail too vivid. The man took a step closer, and I could hear the floorboards creak under his weight. He moved with a calm, methodical pace, like he had all the time in the world. There was something almost clinical about the way he approached the bed, his movements precise and controlled. I could hear my own breath hitch in my throat as he came closer, every instinct screaming at me to run, to fight, to do anything but lie there and watch. But I couldn't. I was completely at his mercy. He stopped at the foot of the bed, standing still for what felt like an eternity. I could see the outline of his body, his broad shoulders, the way his head tilted slightly as if he was studying me. And then, slowly, he leaned forward. His face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel his presence, feel the coldness that seemed to radiate from him. Without a word, he reached out and placed his hand on the edge of the bed. I could feel the mattress dip slightly under his weight, and that's when I noticed something even more terrifying. His hand wasn't just resting there. It was moving, sliding slowly up the bed, towards my foot. The closer it got, the more I could feel the cold seeping through the covers, like the warmth was being sucked out of the room. I tried to scream, tried to thrash, but nothing happened. My mouth wouldn't open, my limbs wouldn't respond. All I could do was watch in horror as his hand moved closer, inch by inch, until it was nearly touching me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The man stood up straight, his hand retracting, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then he turned his head, and I swear I could feel him looking directly into my eyes, even though I couldn't see his. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The message was clear. He was coming back. Then he turned and walked out of the room, the door closing softly behind him, leaving me lying there, paralyzed and terrified. I lay there, staring at the door, too afraid to blink, until finally, after what felt like hours, I could move again. I shot up, gasping for air, and frantically looked around the room. It was empty. The door was closed. There was no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The man had been real. The cold, the footsteps, the pressure on the bed, it had all been real. I haven't slept properly since that night. I've never been one to scare easily. I'm the type who enjoys horror movies and laughs off ghost stories. But what happened to me last month changed everything. It wasn't just the most terrifying experience of my life. It shattered my sense of reality in a way I never thought possible. It was a typical Thursday night, nothing unusual about it. I'd stayed up late working on a project, the glow of my laptop screen the only light in the room. By the time I finally decided to go to bed, I was exhausted. I remember thinking how much I was looking forward to the weekend, to finally getting some proper rest. But that night, sleep was anything but restful. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when it happened. 1 minute, I was in a deep, dreamless slumber, and the next, I was wide awake. But something was wrong. I realized immediately that I couldn't move. My arms, my legs, even my head, it was like I was strapped down to the mattress. Panic set in, a cold wave of fear washing over me as I tried to figure out what was happening. I'd heard of sleep paralysis before, but this was different. This wasn't just being unable to move. This was a feeling of absolute, paralyzing dread, like something terrible was about to happen. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything out of place, but everything was normal. The moonlight filtered in through the blinds, casting familiar shadows on the walls. But then I heard it. A voice. Whispering. It was so close, as if someone was standing right behind me, leaning down to speak directly into my ear. The voice was low, almost soothing, but there was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. I couldn't make out the words at first, just the sound of someone talking, soft, insistent, like they were trying to get my attention. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to move, to turn my head and see who, or what, was behind me. But I was completely frozen, trapped in place by some unseen force. The voice continued, the whispers growing more urgent, more insistent. It was speaking in a language I didn't understand, the words twisting and distorting, but I could feel the intent behind them. It was as if the voice was trying to tell me something important, something that I desperately didn't want to hear. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the voice stopped. Silence. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief, thinking maybe it was over. But that's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of someone's breath on the back of my neck. My entire body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to move, to get away. But I couldn't. I was completely, utterly helpless. The presence behind me was real. I could feel it. The air around me had changed, grown colder, heavier, like something was pressing down on me. And then, in that suffocating silence, I heard the whisper again. But this time, it was different. Clearer. Closer. Don't turn around. The words were sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. I felt my blood run cold, every muscle in my body locked in place by sheer terror. I knew, instinctively, that whatever was behind me, whatever had whispered those words, wasn't human. And it was right there, just inches away. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything to break the spell, but my mouth wouldn't open, my voice trapped in my throat. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, slowly, deliberately, the mattress dipped. Something was pressing down on the bed, right next to me, as if someone, or something, was climbing into bed with me. The pressure grew, inching closer and closer, until I could feel the weight right beside me, so close I could almost touch it. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might stop, the fear overwhelming, suffocating. The presence lingered there for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching on, the only sound my ragged, panicked breathing. I could feel the weight shifting, moving ever so slightly, as if whatever it was settling in, getting comfortable. And then, without warning, the pressure lifted. The presence was gone. Just like that, the weight on my chest disappeared, and I could move again. I shot up in bed, gasping for air, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. My room was empty. The door was shut, the window closed. There was no sign that anyone had been there, no evidence of the terror that had just unfolded. But the fear lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whisper, feel the breath on my neck, the weight on the bed beside me. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a hallucination, that what I experienced was something far more real, far more dangerous. I've tried to convince myself it was just sleep paralysis, just my mind playing tricks on me. But every night, as I lie in bed, I can't help but think about that whisper, those words. Don't turn around. I haven't slept properly since. Because I know, deep down, that whatever was behind me that night, it's still waiting. And if I ever hear that whisper again, I'm not sure I'll have the strength to resist turning around. I never thought it would happen to me. You hear about sleep paralysis, watch videos, read the stories, and you think it's just a weird action of the mind, something that happens to other people. But when you're lying in bed, and it's your own body that betrays you, that's when you realize how horrifying it truly is. It was a Tuesday night, one of those uneventful, ordinary evenings where nothing special happens. I went through my usual routine, brushed my teeth, set my alarm, and crawled into bed, ready to drift off into a dreamless sleep. The clock on my nightstand blinked 12:34 a.m., casting a soft, green glow in the room as I turned onto my side and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I was asleep before it happened. I woke up suddenly, like I had been yanked out of a deep sleep, my heart already pounding as if I had been running. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The room was too quiet, unnervingly so, as if all the sound had been sucked out of the air. And then I realized I couldn't move. Panic set in almost instantly. My body was completely paralyzed, frozen in place as if an invisible weight was pressing me down into the mattress. I tried to scream, to call out for help, but my mouth wouldn't open. It was like being trapped inside my own body, fully awake but completely helpless. I'd heard of sleep paralysis before, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer terror of it. I lay there, my eyes darting around the room, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. My bedroom was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the curtains, everything in its place, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, I heard it. Breathing. It was soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. The slow, deliberate sound of someone, or something, breathing in the dark. My heart raced as I strained to listen, to pinpoint where it was coming from. It wasn't my own breathing. This was something else, something close, too close. The sound was coming from the foot of my bed. I tried to turn my head, to look, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, forced to lie there and listen as the breathing grew louder, more pronounced. It was rhythmic, almost steady, like someone was standing right there, just out of sight, watching me. The realization that I wasn't alone sent a wave of cold terror through me, every muscle in my body tensing against the paralysis. I could feel it now, the presence. It was as if the air had thickened, the temperature dropping ever so slightly. The breathing continued, slow and deep, and I could swear I felt the faintest gust of air against my feet, like the thing at the end of my bed was exhaling. Then I heard movement. A slow shuffle, like feet dragging across the floor. The breathing grew louder, closer, as if whatever it was moving toward me. I tried to scream, to do anything to break free, but it was no use. I was completely paralyzed, my body refusing to respond to the rising panic in my mind. The breathing was right next to me now. I could feel it, the faint warmth of breath against the side of my face, the sound filling my ears. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, I felt the mattress dip. Something was climbing into bed with me. The pressure on the mattress grew, shifting as it moved closer, and I could feel the weight settling beside me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps that I couldn't control. The presence was right there, inches away, the breathing now almost a soft whisper in my ear. Then it stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that's more terrifying than any noise, because it means that whatever was there is now waiting, watching. I could feel the weight beside me, the oppressive stillness of the room pressing down on me like a vice. And then, in the pitch-black silence, I felt it, a hand, cold and clammy, slowly reaching out and resting on my chest. The touch was light, almost gentle, but it sent a wave of terror through me unlike anything I've ever felt. My body was screaming at me to move, to get away, but I was locked in place, completely at the mercy of whatever was lying beside me. The hand didn't move. It just stayed there, a cold, lifeless weight pressing down on my chest, as if it was testing me, seeing how far it could push before I broke. My eyes were wide open, tears streaming down my face as I fought against the paralysis, desperate to break free. But I couldn't. I was trapped, lying in my own bed, with something that shouldn't exist holding me down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pressure on my chest lifted. The hand was gone, the weight beside me disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. I gasped, my body jerking as I finally regained control, sitting up so fast I nearly fell out of bed. The room was empty. There was no sign that anything had been there, no evidence of the terror that had just unfolded. But I knew what I'd felt, what I'd heard. The cold, clammy touch of that hand, the sound of that breathing, it was real. I sat there, trembling, my heart still racing as I stared into the darkness, half expecting it to return. I haven't slept in that bed since. Every night, I lay awake, listening to the silence, terrified that I'll hear that breathing again, that I'll feel that cold hand reach out for me. Because I know now that there are things in the dark, things that don't make sense, things that shouldn't be real. I woke up paralyzed in my own bed, the darkness around me so thick it felt like a heavy curtain suffocating me. My heart raced, pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in my ears. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. All I could do was lie there, my body completely immobile. Then I saw them. Just beyond the edge of my bed, I noticed shadows moving. The shapes were blurry, but they were definitely there, 2 figures. They seemed to blend into the darkness, but I could make out their forms as they moved closer to me. My breathing quickened. I could not even move my hands and leg, which made me panic. I was trapped, unable to move, and these figures were coming closer. In that paralyzing state, my mind raced to find a logical explanation. I knew I was experiencing sleep paralysis, but this was different. I could feel their presence as if they were real. They weren't just figments of my imagination, they were disturbingly real. My eyes locked on them, desperately trying to understand what they were doing. One of the figures leaned closer, its form now clearer. It seemed to be inspecting me, as if analyzing my every breath and twitch. The other figure, taller and more imposing, remained in the background, shifting slightly but never coming too close. The tension was unbearable. I felt like I was a specimen under a microscope, and the figures were studying me with a cold, clinical interest. Minutes felt like hours. Every second was an eternity of dread. The closer figure finally stopped just inches from my face. I could feel its presence, almost like a physical pressure. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. The room returned to its normal darkness, and the paralyzing grip loosened. I could finally move again, but I was left shaking uncontrollably. The next morning, I searched for answers. I was alone in the house, and everything was in place. No one had entered my room, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet, the experience felt so tangible. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been in my room with me. Weeks later, as I recounted the event to a friend, I discovered that they too had experienced something similar, an encounter with shadowy figures during sleep paralysis. They had felt the same sense of being watched and examined. It wasn't just my imagination or a one-time occurrence. There was a pattern, an unsettling reality to our shared experiences. To this day, I can't explain what those figures were or why they appeared so vividly. The sensation of being observed by something that seemed almost sentient remains one of the most unnerving experiences of my life. And though I've learned to manage my sleep paralysis better, I can't forget those particular strangers in the dark. It was the kind of night that made you appreciate the peace of your own home. I had just finished a long shift at work and was exhausted, ready to collapse into bed. I fell asleep almost immediately, but I didn't stay asleep for long. I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to move. It wasn't the first time I'd experienced sleep paralysis, but it was always unsettling. This time, however, something felt different. The usual dark, oppressive feeling was replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to permeate the room. My eyes darted around, but I could only see the faint outlines of my room in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic noise that grew louder with each passing second. It was a sound like someone tapping gently on the walls. The noise was irregular but persistent, like someone trying to communicate a message through Morse code. My heart began to race, and I tried desperately to move, to get out of the grip of paralysis, but my body remained stubbornly still. As the tapping continued, I noticed something strange. The sound seemed to be coming from different directions, sometimes close to my head, other times further away. It was as if whatever was making the noise was circling around me. I tried to focus on the tapping, hoping to discern any pattern or meaning, but it only seemed to intensify my dread. Then, abruptly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. I tried to relax, hoping the paralysis would release its hold. But just as I thought it was over, I felt a cold breeze against my face, despite the windows being shut tight. It was as if someone had opened a window somewhere in the house, but I knew that wasn't possible. Finally, the paralysis broke, and I bolted upright, my heart pounding. I turned on every light in the house, checking the windows and doors, but everything was secure. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been trying to get my attention. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I went through my house, checking for any possible explanations for the tapping sound. Nothing seemed out of place until I noticed something peculiar, a small, barely visible scratch on the wall near my bed. It was too high up for me to have accidentally made it, and it was the same spot where I'd heard the tapping. A week later, my neighbor mentioned that there had been a break-in attempt at a house nearby. The police had been called, and the would-be intruders had fled when they realized someone was home. The description of the suspects was unsettlingly close to the figures I'd imagined in my sleep paralysis. The tapping that night had been more than just a random noise. It felt like a warning, a desperate signal from an unknown source. The experience left me with a profound sense of unease, knowing that the danger had been closer than I ever realized. I was working late on a project, so I decided to crash on my couch instead of heading to bed. I set an alarm for a few hours later to wake up and finish up before going to sleep properly. I fell into a deep sleep, only to be jolted awake by the familiar sensation of sleep paralysis. My body was rigid, unable to move, but my mind was fully alert. I could see the dim light of the living room, but there was something distinctly off. The room felt colder than usual, and a sense of unease hung heavily in the air. That's when I noticed it, a shadow moving across the room. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as the shadow approached, it became clear that it was moving independently of any source of light. It was a figure, dark and featureless, moving with a deliberate slowness. My heart pounded as the figure drew closer. Despite my panic, I tried to stay calm and focus on the figure. It seemed to glide silently, and as it moved closer, I noticed that it had an odd, almost mechanical movement. It was as if the figure was somehow out of sync with the normal flow of things. The closer it got, the more distinct its outline became. It was humanoid, but there was something distinctly unsettling about its presence. The figure stopped right next to where I was lying. I could feel its presence, even though it was just a shadow. My breaths became shallow, and I struggled to understand what was happening. Then, without any warning, the figure reached out a hand, an indistinct, shadowy hand that hovered just above my chest. In that moment, a chilling thought crossed my mind. What if it was trying to harm me? I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My muscles were still locked in place. The figure's hand lingered, and a cold sensation seemed to spread from where it hovered, as if it was draining warmth from the room. Suddenly, the figure pulled back and vanished. The room returned to its normal temperature, and the oppressive feeling lifted. My paralysis broke, and I sat up, gasping for breath. The shadow had disappeared, and everything seemed to be as it should be, but the experience had left me deeply shaken. The next day, I told a friend about the incident, and they suggested I might have been experiencing an intense form of sleep paralysis mixed with vivid hallucinations. I reluctantly agreed, but the physical sensations were so real that I couldn't dismiss them entirely. Later, I discovered that a few neighbors had reported similar experiences, though they described shadows or figures moving around their homes, often coinciding with times of stress or exhaustion. To this day, I can't explain what that figure was or why it appeared so vividly. The feeling of its cold, hovering hand remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I still work late sometimes, but I make sure to get a good night's sleep in my bed, hoping to avoid any more encounters with the unseen.